All right, I finished my general announcements. Quick highlights. CFU 15 is retakeable up until next week, Wednesday. CFU 16 will be passed back on Monday next week, retakeable for a week thereafter. Next week, we'll be covering, other than practice, we'll be doing one new topic, factoring, and then we have a ton of review time scheduled before the test, which is currently slated to be on Thursday, February 20th. Okay. Students are already given time to complete the multiplication at the top of page 20. And the plan for today is to get through 4 problems like this, 4 problems with quadratic formula. Okay. Now, before you start using the quadratic formula, and again, feel free to set up, didn't want to reveal all those numbers yet. There we go. Feel free to set up the quadratic formula with the blanks ready to go. Okay. If you want to do that, no problem. But before you can fill in these blanks, you have to identify the values within the equation. So I'm curious, can anyone tell me why I have one of those values in red, other than the fact that it means it's wrong? I'm letting you know the 11 is wrong. Yes, sir. You have to set the equation equal to 0. So some people might look at this and say, I've got 4x squared, I've got 6x's, and then I've got this 11. The problem is this 11 should not be here. Okay. One of the requirements, why is this thing being so difficult all of a sudden? Let me click. There we go. One of the things that the quadratic formula requires is the equation has to be set to 0. It cannot be set to equal 11. Yes, sir. The 6 wouldn't, you're talking about the 6x? That's not going to change because when you subtract 11 from both sides, the 4x squared is going to stay 4x squared. The 6x is going to stay 6x, but then you're subtracting 11 from both sides. So the only thing that changes, so I revealed these 3 values exactly. Instead of getting the positive 11 on the left side, you end up with a negative 11 on the left side. So the 4 and the 6 are not affected, but that 11 should have been negative, not positive. Okay. And the only way you're going to catch that is if you notice the equation was not equal to 0. Now, in terms of plugging the values into the quadratic equation, you start with the value b. So it's negative b, which is a 6, plus or minus the square root of b, which is a 6 squared, minus 4a, which is a 4, c, which is now we know is a negative 11, all divided by 2a, which is a 4. Now, one thing I want to stress, let me hide those values for just a moment. That 4 that's inside the square root and the 2 that's in the denominator will always be there. They are part of the formula. If you look at the formula, it has a 4 in the square root, it has a 2 in the denominator. So those numbers will always be there. They're part of the equation. Okay, but it's up to you to plug in the other values. Now, one of the things that I stressed yesterday is I would really encourage you all to think of this as 3 different problems that you need to simplify. And I like to start by simplifying those 2 pieces first. Okay, a negative 6 is just negative 6, and a 2 times a 4 is an 8. Okay, so that's where the negative 6 comes from. That's where the positive 8 comes from. And then it's a matter of just figuring out what's inside the square root. And that's why I recommended yesterday, type everything you see here exactly as you see it into the calculator. So I'm going to go to my calculator. I'm focusing on the green, and I'm going to type parentheses 6, parentheses squared, minus 4, parentheses 4, parentheses, parentheses, negative 11, parentheses. Like I'm going to type it exactly as it looks. 6 squared minus 4 times 11 times negative, or 4 times negative 11. So 6 squared minus 4 times 4 times negative 11. Again, that is exactly what you see highlighted in green. Okay, and then I hit enter. Now, the other thing I like to do, okay, is I want to know, is that number a nice clean number or is it an ugly decimal? So the other thing I like to do in the calculator right away is I like to find out, well, what is the square root of that number? And if you get an ugly decimal, that's actually a good thing for you. Because I said this before, that if you get an ugly decimal like that, that means you're done. Like that is your final answer. Negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 212, all divided by 8. Now, if you want to show the work, so notice all this is in green. If you want to take the time to say, well, x is equal to negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 212, all of that divided by 8. If you want to do the math, fine. You're going to get 2 different decimal values, and you can tell me that's your answer. I have no problem with that. If you want to get to the point where you know x is negative 2.57 and 1.07, fine. But you didn't have to go that far. You can stop right at the box. Questions? All right. So remember again, and I tried to highlight this yesterday, the most critical step before you can even start is make sure the equation is actually set to 0. Now, fortunately, in the next problem, that's already happening. We've already got 2x squared minus x minus 15 equals 0. Beautiful. The fact that it's set equal to 0 means I can just copy the coefficients. There are 2 x squareds. There's a negative x. How many x's is that if it just says minus x? 1. So there's minus 1x. And then there's the number negative 15 all by itself. Okay? So before I type in all of these values, I like to, again, set up the structure. I like to just set up my quadratic formula structure. Okay, and remember, again, I set up an empty set of parentheses everywhere where I'm going to be putting a number. Now, the value a, in this case 2, gets used twice. It gets used once next to the 4 and once down on the denominator. Okay? The value b, the negative 1, also gets used twice, right in the beginning and right in the start of the square root. Notice in the very beginning, you're going to get a double negative. Make sure you notice that. You have a double negative here, and that's because the formula says switch the value of b. That negative in front of the b says switch the value of b. Well, if b is already negative, well, then you're supposed to be switching the value of a negative. So you get a double negative and it becomes positive. Okay? And then the c value only gets used once at the end of the square root. Now, again, I would argue simplifying the very first part, negative 1, that's easy enough. That's just 1. Simplifying the bottom, 2 times 2 is 4. That's easy enough. The more challenging bit is figuring out what is this value inside the square root. Okay? So I'm going to type all of that exactly as it appears into my calculator. Parenthesis negative 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 15. So negative 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 15. And this is going to tell me inside the square root is the number 121. And like I said before, I like to take the square root of it right away just to know, do I need to keep going? So I'm going to be honest, if I were you, I'd be hoping this is a decimal value. Because if you get a whole number, it means you're not done. Okay? So I now know this is 121, and I'm going to warn you, you cannot stop here. Do not stop there. Because the square root of 121 is a nice, clean number. You need to actually work that out. So we got to keep going. Okay, so now we know x is going to be equal to either 1 plus 11 or 1 minus 11. And either way, you're dividing by 4. Now, 1 minus 11 is negative 10. 1 plus 11 is positive 12. So that's what you need to figure out. Negative 10 divided by 4 and 12 divided by 4. 12 divided by 4 is nice because that's a multiple of 4. That's just 3. But 10 divided by 4 is a decimal. Not too bad, though. It's just negative 2.5. So that is what your final answer should look like. X should be negative 2.5 and 3. Questions? All right, jumping down to the next problem, number 3. Again, the thing that I noticed right away, which is really convenient, is that equation at the top of the screen, it's already set to 0. So I don't need to do any extra work to get it equal to 0. I can just copy the numbers I see. I see 4x squareds, I see negative 2x's, and I see negative 9 by itself. That's what we call a constant, a number that's by itself. So once again, I set up the structure for the quadratic formula, and then I start to plug in my values. A is equal to 4, and that goes in 2 places, next to the 4 and in the denominator. B is equal to negative 2. That also goes in 2 places, in the very beginning and at the start of the square root. And then our C value is negative 9. That gets used exactly once at the end of the square root. Now, once again, it is my opinion, morning, sir, that I can simplify the front very quickly. Negative -2 is just positive 2. And on the bottom, I have 2 times 4, which is 8. So the only real math that I need to do to kind of continue moving forward is figuring out what is this craziness inside the square root. What'd you get? 148. All right. And I want to show everybody where Tao is getting that. I'm going to type this exactly as you see it. -2 squared minus 4 times -9. -2 squared minus 4 times, what was it, 4 and -9? There we go. And that's exactly what Tao told us, 148. Okay. Now, again, what I like to do is I like to take the square root of that number right away because I want to see, is this an ugly number or not? By the way, I already know it's going to be ugly because the square root of 144 is 12. So I already know this is not going to be a whole number. It's going to be 12 point something, a little bit higher than 12. 12.1 makes sense. Okay. But again, that's good for us because since that's an ugly decimal, bless you, I'm telling you, I will accept that as your final answer. Yes, sir. Yeah, go for it. Now, again, we're done with problem number 3, but I want to continue to say, if you want to take the time to figure out, well, what is 2 plus or minus the square root of 148? And what do I get when I divide that by 8? And then you want to get me those ugly decimals and you want to report that as your final answer, no problem. You'll get full credit for that. Questions before we move to the last problem of the day? Philip, you good? Last problem of the day, sir. All right. So once again, something I noticed right away, this equation is not set equal to 0. This is a problem. It's not equal to 0, it's equal to -2. So the way we get rid of, so it would be wrong for me to claim these are the values. That would be bad. Okay, yes, I have 3x squared, so I'm fine with the 3. Yes, I have -6x, so I'm fine with the -6. I don't like the -2 because that's on the other side. So what I would do here is I would add 2 to both sides. Now, that's not going to affect the 3x squared. It's not going to affect the -6x. But when I add 2 to both sides, you're going to get a positive 2 on the left, and then the 2 on the right is going to cancel out to 0. That's what we need. And so instead of a -2, we're going to have a positive 2. And now I'm ready to get rolling. Okay? So once again, we set up our quadratic formula. I'm going to plug in my values. A, which is 3, gets used twice. B, which is -6, also gets used twice. But the C value of 2 only gets used 1 time. Now again, I've got a double negative here. You got to be careful about that. -6 is +6. And on the bottom, 2 times 3 is also 6. So you actually end up with a pair of 6s. But again, I need to use my calculator to figure out what is that stuff equal to inside the square root. All right? So I'm going to do -6 squared minus 4 times 3 times 2. -6 squared minus 4 times 3 times 2. And we get 12. Now, again, I like to right away take the square root of that number just to see what I'm dealing with. By the way, I know the square root of 9 is 3. I know the square root of 16 is 4. So the fact that 12 is between 9 and 16 tells me I'm not going to get a whole number. I'm going to get something between 3 and 4. And I get 3.464. So this is our final answer. Again, if you want to show the work of what do I get for 6 plus or minus the square root of 12, all divided by 6, and you want to give me those decimals, no problem. I'll take it. But you can stop here. Questions? Okay, so we're done for the day. We have about 20 minutes left in the period. I would tell students work on homework 50, which is only 3 problems. You can probably get that done in about 10 minutes. And if you haven't done homework 49, that was more quadratic formula stuff. Both homework 49 and 50 focus on the same practice. So I would recommend you use this time to work on those assignments. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.